It's a pleasure to be here in Dallas, and I've lectured in this room actually once before. Many years ago, I was one of the competitors for the Wiley Theater here in Dallas, which we didn't win, so I guess you have to lose some of them. But it's nice to be back here again. Our office is actually named after a mountain. You can see the mountain here in the distance, covered in clouds. It's a very beautiful place. The significance of this mountain has very many levels of understanding to us. Certainly, we enjoy its beauty and its history. You may think you've never heard of the mountain SNØHETTA, but you probably have, because inside the mountain in Norse mythology is where Valhalla is located, and probably all of you have heard of Valhalla, the great palace where the Norse warriors would go upon their deaths. So there's an interesting link between architecture and landscape here. And also what's important to us is that our company is not named after a person. So many people will come to me and they say, it's nice to meet you, you're very interesting, but when do I get to meet the SNØHETTA person? So I usually give them directions to this mountain and see what happens. We have offices located around the world. In fact, we began our studios together in Oslo. We've since opened an office in New York. We have a small studio in San Francisco, a rather interesting studio in Innsbruck, and a couple of people hanging out in Singapore and actually in Stockholm. So we're working around the world, but it's important to us that we are in the places where we work. So we're not about importing our ideas, we're about engaging with places and bringing our ideas together with those in the places that we find ourselves. As was mentioned by Nate, there is a Texas connection. It's interesting, I think I only lived in Texas maybe 7 years, but now apparently everyone calls me a Texan. I went to my senior year of high school in San Antonio, and I went to university in Austin. I have family here. My parents live in Houston. And my aunt, actually, who's here tonight, there she is right there. She's coming down, so she'll be surprised. This is my aunt right here. That's my aunt. I love this picture. She's just as beautiful today as she was in this picture. So I'm very happy that she's come here. She lives north of Dallas. And my cousin Christopher, who's sitting next to her, is here tonight too. So there's a bit of a connection to this world, and I'm happy to be a part of it. I won't talk a lot about our old work. I've been working now for 30-odd years, and most of these older projects have been well presented. But just in case some of you don't know very much about us, our first commission, as was mentioned by Nate, was the revival of the Great Library of Alexandria in Egypt. I remember many years ago I spoke in Ohio and was giving a talk and discussing our project in Alexandria. And in the questions and answers, someone stood up and said, you know, I've lived in Alexandria, Virginia all my life, and I've never seen this library before. So this is not in Virginia. It's in Egypt, in the place where Cleopatra once had her palace and where her affiliations with Mark Antony and Julius Caesar took place. Actually, just in the foreground of this picture was where Cleopatra's palace once stood. So it took us 12, 13 years to build this project. I was, as Nate mentioned, very young, 28 years old when we won this commission. I remember we had absolutely no money. Our studio we made in a spot that we found in a hospice that we paid $25 a month for, and we had to use cardboard boxes to sit on. And we drew this thing up and sent it off, never thinking we would win. And when we won, it was rather exciting. And I remember I had to use all of my prize money to pay for the airplane ticket to fly to Egypt to collect the prize money. So it was a zero-sum game. But there it was. When we showed up, it was a bunch of kids, and I actually had hair at that time. So I had longer hair, and when we arrived to collect the prize, the competition was anonymous, so they didn't know who we were. And they looked at us and said, well, are you the architects? And we said, yes, we're SNØHETTA. And there was a look of shock on their face, and they said, well, you're too young. This is a $380 million building of international stature. You're too young to be the architect. And I think it just kind of slipped out of my mouth. I said, it's a good thing you're choosing young architects because anyone else will be dead by the time this thing is finished. And it took us Yeah, I think about 13 years, but we did it. We worked night and day. We worked every hour, every weekend, as long as it took. This is a facade of the building. It has about 60,000 square feet of hand-carved granite, which is monolithic and load-bearing. So it's about, I think, roughly 16 inches thick, this stone, all carved by hand in Egypt. The stone itself is rather beautiful and was inspired by the Rosetta Stone, which perhaps you're familiar with. It was a key artifact in helping us understand and translate hieroglyphs through Aramaic and other languages. In a sense, the facade of the building is a representation of our knowledge as seen through language. There are over 10,000 years of history on this facade, covering hundreds of languages, and ways of symbols, creating symbols to create language. In order to find the stone in a place close to Alexandria, it was quite difficult. There's not that much granite available easily in the area, certainly in Alexandria, which is at the mouth of the Nile. So we discovered through talking to people that there was a granite quarry in the south of Egypt on the border of Sudan that had been unused for 400 years. And it just happened to be in the middle of a demilitarized zone because Egypt and Sudan were at war with one another. And so it was perhaps our only chance. So we negotiated with both governments. They allowed us to open up this quarry, and we didn't really know much about it. The stone craftsmen from Egypt, who really were the primary protagonist in this episode, started to dig around in the sand, and we actually discovered that this was the same quarry that most of the stones of Karnak were quarried from over 3,000 years earlier. So in a way, it was fascinating to see these unfinished obelisks in the sand that are still sitting there now because they can't be taken out or even put in a museum due to the political conditions in this area. But here you see a picture of the column of Karnak and the facade of the stones of Alexandria in Egypt. There's about it's really more like 4,000 years separating these two rocks, and they came from exactly the same place. So it's intriguing to me to recognize as our first project, as my first project as an architect, the value of the work that we do and the time span that these things really represent. We so often get caught up in our world, and especially today as things move quicker and quicker, there's this speed to life that at a certain point in time, we have to realize that some of these things that we make will be here for hundreds, if not thousands of years. And what this might mean to future generations is a fascinating concept. Even if it's a little house or something that you don't expect to last, it just might. The ceiling and roof of the building was created out of a very high technology. So whereas the granite itself is very low technology, actually hand-carved, the roof was made out of sandwiched aluminum panels, which are a honeycomb sandwich panel construction. This is the same construction that's used to create the shell of the space shuttle, so it's perhaps the highest technology that we have in terms of creating materials. So to create make a building that it has both handmade granite facade and the highest of technology in terms of equipment and machining was quite fascinating in a country that has millennia of building history. The interior of the building seats about 3,500 people. It's naturally lit, and we designed the furniture as well as the room itself. When laying out furniture in such a large space, it's almost like creating an urban plan. The building is 160 meters in diameter, so nearly 2 football fields in length in one direction and about a football field in width. So quite a large space to occupy. The building was designed with many very important characteristics that were new to the region. First of all, it was the first building in the Middle East and the Eastern Mediterranean that was fully accessible by the handicapped, so we designed it to disability standards. This had never been done before. It was also open access to men and women equally. In fact, today there are now over 50% of the staff are female, which is an interesting proportion for the region. It's open to many types of book collections. In fact, there's Hebrew books there, and rather amazingly, a copy of Satanic Verses by Salman Rushdie is in this building. It has an amazing sort of consequence for the region. We finished the building, and we're quite excited by the fact that 10,000 people a day were visiting it from the region. And then suddenly, of course, the Arab Spring happened, and in 2011, you may remember the great protests that occurred across northern Africa, and certainly in Egypt. The protests actually in Egypt began inside the library. Most people think of Tahrir Square in Cairo, but that came later. So the first individuals to talk about democracy in Egypt met in the Alexandria Library, and it spread first to Alexandria, to the streets, and then to Cairo. And so the first we heard of it, we started to see pictures like this online. The library is actually located just where that fire is coming from, so just behind these buildings. And we thought, oh my God, I just spent 13 years losing all my hair just so the damn thing will burn down. And you know, it has a history of burning down, so it's entirely possible. And it was horrific, though. I mean, it's funny now, but it was truly horrific. 200 people died in the first 3 weeks of the protest to democratize their country. So this tells you the power of how we must feel when we think about the politics of where we live. So the next thing we saw was this. After we started to send messages to Egypt, you know, what's going on? Is the library burning? And instead, the library was absolutely protected. And the citizens of Alexandria and the students of the university adjacent to the building formed a human circle around the building to protect it, a human chain, so that nobody could come in and cause any damage to the building or burn the collections or anything like that. What's more impressive about this than the fact that they held hands and protected the building is that this was both anti-government and pro-government factions setting their politics aside in order to protect what they felt was an important piece of culture in their community. So once again, this is a lesson learned. We walk past libraries every day and we don't think about them, or we browse books on the internet and we think, well, okay, it's a book. But these things have enormous consequences in our lives. And it's not until things get really, really rough that we start to recognize their value. And so I learned from that quite a bit. These are pictures sent to me from people in Alexandria, so they're grainy, they're a bit grainy. This was someone who saw this woman in a conservative outfit taking a photograph with her cell phone of very contemporary art on the wall. So it's bridging very many different types of culture. We sent someone back 6 months ago to Egypt just to see how the building was doing. And the reports were quite exciting. Number of visitorship is back up to around 10,000 as it was pre-revolution period. The children's and young people's library has expanded from 200 to 600 young adults inside the building. They have special activities for young women to learn about things like architecture, which is again new as a concept in this part of the world. So we're very proud of that. And this was amazing. They actually lit up the roof of the library pink for Breast Cancer Awareness Week, which in this part of the world, even just the thought of talking about breast cancer 20 years ago when I first visited was unfathomable. So the building is starting to connect worlds, which is I'm very happy for because it is a sense of maturity. The building is taking on a life of its own. That library led us to a number of other libraries that we've built since then, some in the United States. This was a library for North Carolina State University in Raleigh, and it's named after a former governor, James B. Hunt Jr. It's a building which is situated on a rather conservative campus made primarily of brick, sort of neo-Georgian or somewhat neo-Georgian commercial style architecture. And we worked with creating a contemporary yet complementary expression that would adapt to its region. One of the most important features of the building is this solar fin, which helps eliminate ultraviolet light penetration into the interior of the reading rooms while maximizing the amount of view. And one of the beautiful characteristics of these fins is that not only in the day, but also at night, they reflect the interior ambient light from the users inside the library to the exterior. And if you look very closely, you can see something that I'm quite excited about, and that is this sort of very soft line where the light moves very slowly towards darkness and then back to lightness again. Sometimes there are hard edges and sometimes there are soft edges. And this isn't just a trick of the camera, it really does exist when you're there. And I often say that as architects, We have a very hard time making soft lines like this. It's very easy to make hard lines. And even when we say we're making a soft line, it's just a kind of curvy thing. It's essentially a hard line that's been bent into a curve. It's still a hard line. But to get an ephemeral line, a line that changes throughout the day, I think is a particular gift that we can work with in the creation of architecture. As you move through the building, there's a series of staircases that lead you up into the reading areas. But one feature that's quite dramatic is this particular device. It's an automated retrieval system. It's a book robot, sometimes referred to as a book bot. So 2 million books in this library are held by this robot. And if you want to get a book, you go online and you scan, just like Amazon or something, you can see the spines of the book. You can virtually pull the book off a shelf. You can read through the pages of the book, so it's not just the title. It's like scanning a real bookshelf. And if you like a book, you push a button, and this robot goes and gets it for you, and it can get it to you in about 10 minutes' time. The technology is rather advanced. It was an exciting idea, and so we made 2 windows into the book bot, so that when you ask for your book, you can go over and watch it. And when you call a book, all the lights go off and it kind of flashes. It's like a disco in there, and people give names to the robots. There's 5 of them, and they see which robot is going to get their book. And you can also go to this little screen here, and it's got a sort of Google-type function, almost like I'm feeling lucky. You just push a random book, and the robot will just bring you a totally random book. And what's amazing about that is that if the book hasn't been checked out for, say, 5 years or more, every data screen in the library freezes. It shows the name of that book and says, wow, this book just got checked out, first time in 5 years. And everybody wants to see that book. So it's actually increased the amount of book circulation in the library, which we think is, of course, important in this context. The stairs are very energetic. As you move up the stairs, they're yellow, they're bright. They energize you. And so although this building is 5 stories high, rarely do people take the elevator, because at the top of the staircase is this balcony overlooking the beautiful landscape of North Carolina and the Smoky Mountains. And so as a result, because the stairs are so exciting and so interesting, and they're designed in such a way that they don't scare you or feel ominous, although admittedly there's some amazing ominous steps inside this museum that go up like 14 flights. But here they're broken up, and the elevators are sort of recede in the background. So about 85% of the people using this library, which, by the way, is an extension of the barbecue belt that we're in currently, is a place where people don't often take the stairs. And so more people are taking the stairs in this building than they had previously. And we find that exciting. You've probably seen this building presented in the media. It's the National Ballet and Opera in Oslo, Norway, another anonymous competition shortly after we won the Alexandria Library. It's characterized primarily by these platforms, which lead you from the actual surface of the water in the fjord, which is salt water, all the way to the roof of the opera itself. And you can go stand on the top and enjoy the landscape without necessarily buying a ticket to the opera. There's been about 12 million people that have gone onto the roof of the opera since we've finished the building of it, which is an exceptional number. It's increased opera sales dramatically. Now they rarely, if ever, have empty seats in the building. And so much so because of the character of the acoustics, which is very important that we have a room which is sort of horseshoe-shaped based on Italian theater of the past 400 years, so that not only are these features of the exterior urban realm important, but also the acoustics and sightlines inside the building, such that now they sometimes can't have enough shows to meet audience demand. So in this particular case, it was Carmen, the opera Carmen, that was playing inside. There's 1,340 seats inside the opera, and they didn't have enough shows, so they had to simulcast Carmen, which of course everybody loves Carmen. It's super sexy and it's Spanish and we all like it. So, everybody wanted to see it, so they simulcast the opera outside. So there are 1,300 people inside and 4,000 people outside watching it on a screen. It was a very cold winter day, too. This isn't the most people. Actually, the most people that have witnessed an event or a performance on the roof of the opera is about 35,000, which came to see Justin Bieber. And so I've seen pictures of it. I wasn't there, but I don't think I will ever have another building that has 35,000 crying teenagers on it at one time. They were all just in tears. There's also a great many performances inside the building, random performances. The building is set up so that you can have informal kind of activity in many, many locations, this being in the lobby in front of an Olafur Eliasson sculpture that actually is the cladding to the toilets. Outside the building, that not only does the ramp lead you to this wonderful venue where you can oversee the city and where you can stand up there and feel it's yours, you can also walk right down to the water's edge. In order to make this building, we had to remove 60,000 tons of raw pollutants that were in the bed of the fjord, because this area was highly industrialized for over 200 years. Once we removed the pollutants or stabilized them, bird life, fish life, insect life, animal life has returned to this part of the fjord. And these two swans appeared really the day it finished. And in fact, I guarantee, I will bet anybody goes there, you'll see at least two swans there, or some other kind of creature swimming along the edge. And if you don't see any swans, you'll at least see a weird kind of thing like that, like a human creature standing on the corner doing something funny. The exciting thing about the opening of an opera is that you never know what to expect, no matter how skilled you are. So we waited up all night after the opening night. We had kings and queens and presidents there to open the building, and we wanted to see the headlines, and we were hopeful it would say, great acoustics, wonderful sight lines, great show. And instead, the first headline that we saw, since you probably don't speak Norwegian, said, a couple caught having sex on the roof of the opera. So while we were in there, someone was above us consummating the building. They were apparently politely asked to remove themselves from the venue and finish their activities elsewhere. But apparently this has become a sport, so I think there is a place online where if you've had sex on the roof of the opera, you can tick your name off. We also get a great many films and clips always being sent to us. So the next is a kind of film that someone sent to us. Hopefully this will work. This is entirely illegal. The French Daredevil. Do not try this unless you're a professional. Comes the police, I think. Yeah, wow. So that was a strange thing to click on the link one day at work. The video goes on, and the reason I stopped it here is look at that really weird car back there. That's actually Norway's first electric car, which we were also involved with the design of. So that was a rather strange coincidence. I guess apparently people are getting AIA credits for this talk tonight, but you will have lost all your credits just now by watching that film. So no more professional activity. We were then, since that time, asked to create more performing arts centers. We've been working on a number of theaters over the years. This is one of the more recent theaters we've completed. It's in Canada on Lake Ontario, just east of Toronto. It's a rather beautiful setting, and as you can see here on a warm summer day, the gentle waves of Lake Ontario lapping against the shore. But this being Canada, this is actually really what it looks like most of the time. So Lake Ontario in the winter is quite heavily frozen, and this is the view from the lobby of that theater. And it's rather special because you can go out onto the lake and look back to the theater itself. And it's become a part of the community. It's based on an idea that the university had to build a university building that the local community could use. So it's off campus, and it invites people of all persuasions to use the building. Perhaps the most spectacular characteristic of this theater is that it's designed to hold about 550 people, and it only uses natural acoustics. So you can have anywhere from a soloist with a violin or a guitar or a whistle, all the way up to a 70-person orchestra. And neither of those ranges will require any electroacoustic amplification whatsoever. And it sounds perfect. So it was modeled after the great music houses of Europe from the 1600s, 1700s. And each piece of wood, each piece of the framework of the interior of this room is designed entirely around the acoustic characteristics of the space. And all the wood came from Ontario, within 500 miles roughly of the building itself. So it's kind of connected to its place in many, many ways. After we won those other big competitions, we were asked to submit for the National September 11th Memorial Museum in New York City. I was living in Norway at the time, and I actually said no several times to do this. It seemed like this should be a thing that New Yorkers should solve for themselves or take care of themselves. But after some goading, we finally decided to enter. And actually, by the way, I was telling Nate this morning, in Europe, where I was living at the time, you do dates with the day, the month, and the year. In America, you do month, day, year. So the month, day are reversed. So I misread the delivery date. I thought it was in November and it was July, and it was actually, I only had 72 hours to do the damn thing, as opposed to 4 months or whatever I thought. It was a shock. We did the competition. We sent it off, literally finished it in 72 hours, and it was against Frank Gehry and some others, and somehow we won. And we went there to collect the prize, and we started the project. It's the smallest building at the site. It was a terribly difficult project to work on. As you are aware, it was a traumatic time in our history, a place where most of us have some kind of fateful memory. I myself was on a plane, amazingly, landing at JFK at 9 o'clock in the morning on September 11th in 2001. As I looked out the window, the second airplane hit the other tower. So I didn't know what it was, but I saw the event, and then we went to Canada. We were diverted. But we were then thrown all together, all these people, in the midst of all this trauma. Everyone that worked on this project, other than myself, were either in the building, near the building, or lost someone in the building. So to build up a project from that level of challenge was quite difficult. We created a very horizontal structure, which is very different from the vertical buildings that you see nearby. We like to say that if our building weren't there, these 50, 60, 80-story skyscrapers would just pound down onto the memorial site. So we're the kind of stepping stone that links this massive world of commercialism to the introspective world of the memorial. We often say that if the memorials reflect the absence of those lives lost, our building reflects the presence of who we are now and who we are as we visit this place. It's about our life in a particular moment of time. The building surface is composed of stainless steel, which is etched very lightly with a kind of angel hair scratches that reflect light back into the environment. So this is amazing, because this is the north facade of the building. All of this light is being projected from a side of the building that gets no direct sunlight. It's simply picking up ambient light in the space around it and projecting it back into its surroundings. As you move around the building, this light is always changing, and you're always aware of the change. Inside the building, there are many artifacts, including these two magnificent columns that were part of the rescue effort for artifacts that were on the site. I was a part of the group that looked at these artifacts when they were finally taken to JFK Airport. The artifacts used two airplane hangars that were big enough to house a 747. So two 747 hangars side by side. As far as you could see, wall to wall, edge to edge, artifacts that were taken from the recovery effort from the World Trade Center site. And all of that represented only 0.0001% of all the material that fell to the earth on that particular day. And these columns were rather magnificent. They were hard to bring there. They're cut in half because we couldn't get them there in one piece through the road system from JFK. But it's interesting to look at these two columns and realize these are the original columns from the original towers, and just behind in the distance, juxtaposed against them, is the new World Trade Center towers that were built in the reconstruction effort. As you move past those columns and you move down into the museum, you'll often look ahead and see there's a whole lot of people looking in at you. And that's an interesting experience, because what happens is that the exterior of this building is highly reflective. So a lot of people will want to go up and see what it is. And as they go up and look inside to try and see what it is, what do they see but other people looking back at them? And there's a kind of moment of shock. It's a sort of voyeuristic kind of discovery that, wait, there's people there. And in that moment, when you see others looking at you, total strangers, you recognize your value in this moment in time. And that erases the memory of everything and then draws you back into the memory once again of the events that have occurred there. This is the last picture I'll show of this project. It's a picture I took one day going down the steps, and I love it. It's a young girl looking at her reflection in the exterior facade. She's dancing, she's smiling, and I think certainly one can feel a sense of accomplishment when you can bring at least one smile to a place of such tragedy. I'm fascinated by the idea that the mother isn't even taking a picture of her daughter. She's taking a picture of the reflection of her daughter in the glass. And I love the color. And you know, it was a very difficult project. I think I lost whatever else hair that I had left to lose. But a tremendous feeling to be connected to it over 10 years. So this brings us to a rather unusual image. Why would a picture like this appear in an architecture lecture? Well, we've been talking about politics and the ramifications of politics and how they might interact with architecture. We might see pictures like this often, and certainly as the politics of the world around us get more and more intense, people are arguing more with each other, there's more animosity, there's more polarization in our world. And when we see this type of polarization, this man who's hitting this other man, our first reaction is to say, well, these crazy people, that guy on the right, he's obviously crazy, or the person on the left, he said something wrong, or the politicians made him do it, or reactionaries did this, or we blame everybody except ourselves. We will never see ourselves in this picture. So why is that? And especially as architects, we have to ask ourselves, are we really innocent in this photograph? Because if you look at this photograph carefully, you'll see that these people are having this argument within the confines of everything that architects have designed. We've designed the stairs, we've designed the plaza, we've designed the buildings, we've designed the framework within which these types of reactions occur. So we're sort of building a zoo for ourselves, I like to say. We are self-domesticating creatures. When you have a cow on a farm, we have domesticated that cow. That cow was perfectly fine where it was until we came along and said, we're going to make meat and milk out of you. And then we domesticated it, and it lives somehow in this blind happiness on the farm. But we do this to ourselves. So the example I like to give is if you go to a zoo and you see a polar bear cage, and the polar bear cage is not very well designed, it doesn't represent its natural habitat, the polar bear will walk back and forth, it'll pace, it'll get aggressive, it'll lick wounds on itself, it'll hurt other polar bears that it might not have hurt otherwise, because its habitat is incorrectly aligned with its natural condition. If you put that same polar bear in a well-designed zoo habitat, it will probably at least live a more comfortable, more reasonable life. We do this, we build our own zoo cages for ourselves. Everything in here, this room that we're in is our little cage. The lights the way they line up, the wall panels the way they meet, the steps the way they are, the colors that we find acceptable, everything that we call civilization is our own little universe of habitat that we self-create. And this, of course, was most welcomely said by Marshall McLuhan, the great thinker, that the environment that we create becomes our medium for defining our role in it. So it's a kind of a two-way street. We make things, and the things that we make to house ourselves affect us and make us into a certain kind of creature. And then we, in turn, make more things that make us into the same kind of creature. So somehow we have to understand what that really means. So one of the things that we do in our office is we ask a lot of questions. We don't like to say that a concept is an answer. If you're an architect, you probably hear the word concept a lot except when you're doing toilet schedules and stair schedules and things like that, or specs. But basically, in the beginning of a project, everybody says, what's the concept? And, you know, a lot of people say, well, here's my concept, it's this and this and this. But the truth is, how do you know the answer if you haven't asked the right question? You must be able to ask the appropriate question to get an appropriate answer. And a really great question actually doesn't have an answer. And children know this. Kids like to come up to you and say, why is the sky blue? And you say, well, because there's moisture in the air. Well, why does that make it blue? Well, because the moisture diffracts, you know, blue light. Well, why does it do that? They just keep going until you can't answer anymore. You get fed up and go watch TV or something. Tell the kids to watch TV. And then you say to yourself, well, you know, what's great here is that this is a line of inquiry. It's a line of exploration. A concept is a line of exploration. It's not really an answer. So we do this a lot in our office. We ask a lot of questions. One of the questions we ask ourselves is essentially, what is habitat? If we're making habitat and we're talking about habitat, how do you define it? So most of us think about habitat in the biological sense. It's called biotic habitat. These are the relationships between living organisms, you know, like frogs and flies, snakes and spiders. They're things like plants and animals, microbes, bacteria, the things that we call life. It's easy for us to understand that kind of habitat, right? It's flowers, it's all the living things. There's also abiotic habitat or non-biological habitat, which is a part of the framework of the world that we live in. These are things like air. Air isn't alive, it's just there. Water, minus all the living things in it, is just stuff. It's not alive. Soil, minus the bacteria and everything in it, is just an inert element. And also buildings, rooms, plazas, everything that we make, that's part of our abiotic habitat. There's a relationship between these two worlds. So one of the things we began to recognize was that we're starting to see changes in our habitat even as we speak. First, we began to notice, of course, the decline in bee populations. Probably many of you have read about this. Bee populations have been in massive decline since really World War II. They're almost in some places extinct. And this is very important to us because the bee population fertilizes and pollinates most of the food resources that we require to live. So the decline in bee population will also affect our own population. So we wondered, what could we do about this? So we decided to design a beehive. Nobody paid us to do this. We thought, how could it actually work to help increase bee habitat? We know that some of the problems of bee population loss are related to chemicals, so as architects it's a little hard to manage the chemical life of the world around us. But what we can do is look at the life cycle of a bee. So a bee that's domesticated, because most bees are domesticated for honey use, they basically live in this place that's their hive. And several times a day a beekeeper will come, lift the top off of the beehive, put smoke in there. The smoke knocks the bee out, so they're kind of drunk. And then they pull the bee hive out, and they scrape off the honey, and then put it back in, and about 20 minutes later, the bees wake up and go, wow, what the hell just happened? It's like, where are my kids? They're all gone. You know, it's like, it's incredibly radical. So we decided to make a beehive where bees could just live there. This is not for domesticating honey. They would simply live there. They would live out their lives in a natural way, and it would provide them at least a safe and stable habitat. We knew that if we wanted to get this on buildings, people would say, no way, I don't want any bees on my building. That's just disgusting. So as a result, we had to make them kind of sexy looking. So we made these really good looking beehives that people would want to have on their roofs. And here's a view of one of them on the roof of a marketplace. It has a very simple access way for the bees to move in. They can be accessed, if need be, from a hinged door at the back. They're modeled after the framework of traditional beehives, so even though the bee may or may not understand that, it's a characteristic of the design. We built them in the studio, so again, we just made this on our own, so this was a sort of self-made project, and then that we've started to put them up. We're hoping that these will start to appear in more places, so we're working on that. Another interesting animal that we thought about were birds. Now, in classical architecture, traditional architecture, it's not uncommon to see great busts of birds, great statuary of birds, eagles, owls, falcons on the facades and trim of these great historical buildings. But if a real bird were actually to land on a building, we immediately get out a gun and shoot it. So it's like, we'll take the fake bird, but the real bird's absolutely not. So we thought, why is this? Well, of course, real birds are a maintenance problem. They cause dirt. They do all kinds of things to your building that you have to manage, and so it's a problem for most people. What if we could make a part of a building that actually incorporates their life into the facade so that we can provide habitat for creatures that have been displaced by all of these things we're making? So we made a little insert that would fit into a concrete masonry unit. It's made of several layers. You take the layers off, it can allow for different types of creatures to live in it. By the way, we had people working on the actualities of bird life, because I guarantee you, if you ask most architects to design a birdhouse, I don't know, it'll look like something postmodern or God knows what. It won't have anything to do with birds. This one was the first thing we did was let's ask a bird what it needs. And here you can see the result. It's actually very elegant. It can be built along the facade. If you take some of the pieces off, it could even house squirrel life or other types of fauna. And one thought was that you could put a one-way mirror on the inside of it so that you could look in and see the nesting habits of the bird inside, but it couldn't see you, so you wouldn't bother it. That's the client there on the lower right. Another animal habitat that we worked with was a wild reindeer observatory. Near the mountain of SNØHETTA is one of the few places in the world where wild reindeer migrate. A lot of people love to go see those reindeer because it's such a beautiful sight. The problem is reindeers really don't like people looking at them, especially during mating season. It's a little embarrassing, I guess, for them. So what we did was create a kind of platform up on the valley's edge where you can look down into this magnificent valley. That's SNØHETTA back there in the clouds. So it's right where our name comes from. And you can sit in this warm and comfortable place and enjoy the view without interfering with the life of the reindeer. There's an interesting feature to this. These little things here, these little struts or supports that stabilize the glass. You may think, oh, that's necessary for the architecture. Actually, it's not, and these were added after the building was finished, because what we failed to take into account was that there are muskox that live in this area. And the muskox would walk by the building, and the alpha males would see their reflection in the glass and then just run right to it and smash their head against it. So this is actually muskox protection, so that we also had to take away some of the landscapes so that the muskox would never be high enough to see their reflection. And there are some of the muskox living now happily nearby the reindeer pavilion. And every couple of years, we get our whole office. We try to get together. We climb up SNØHETTA. We have as much fun as we possibly can. Then we come back down. We drink some schnapps inside the pavilion and talk about our office and try to enjoy an intellectual discourse, if that's possible, at this surrounded by muskox. A number of other projects working with habitat. Most recent, and perhaps I would say that this is our most, maybe my favorite, most amazing project we're working on. We're reconstructing a waterfall in Oregon City, which is just nearby south of Portland, about 20-30 minutes. It's Willamette Falls. Willamette Falls was, at one time, the second largest waterfall by volume behind Niagara Falls. Over the years, it's been industrialized, and the waterfall has been minimized until such point that very little of it is left. So if you know waterfall sort of geometry, the water usually starts in one location, and as it grows, it erodes the rock and gets longer and longer and longer and longer. So prior to colonization by industry, the waterfall went all the way from here, all the way to there, and all the way back to there. Industry moved in, they diverted the water, they made a bunch of mills, they made a hydroelectric power plant, and now you can see the water barely falls. There's a little trickle that goes through there, and everything else is being diverted, which is fine for industry, except that now that industry has changed and these types of facilities are no longer in use, and nothing is left of this industry. So it's an entirely vacant, brownfield, ghost industrial site with this ghost of a waterfall. And the idea is to bring the waterfall back to life, preserve the culture of the colonists and those people that industrialized the site, and furthermore, deal with the First Nations or indigenous peoples who consider this waterfall sacred in their culture, which is actually the equivalent of about 10 different tribes that live in this part of Portland. The tribal groups still use the waterfall, what little there is left of it, to fish and to hunt. They actually fish for lamprey. Saying fish is a bit of a a misnomer because they basically stand under the waterfall, and when they see a lamprey, which is like an eel, they just reach out and grab it and stick it in a bag wrapped around their waist. It's amazing. They can grab 50 or 60 lamprey in about an hour. So it's a rather magnificent thing to see. So they have a very special relationship to it. It has been used as a leisure site for many years as well as an industrial site. Here's an overview of the site with the falls sort of kind of running. And you can see all of these buildings, every single one of them is absolutely empty. There's no one in it. No company owns it. It now belongs to the state. And the purpose of the project is to bring the waterfall back and respect the culture of the industry that was there. It's a rather awe-inspiring place to walk through. It's a kind of almost, a sort of feeling of beauty amidst all of this carnage, which is a kind of rare experience to have. The waterfall still floods every now and then, so once in a while Mother Nature comes in, kicks in, and says, I don't care what you've done, what kind of dams you've made, I'm coming through. So the whole area just is overwhelmed with water, so there's a high water line. So we've started to evaluate the high water line. We've started to represent in new development sites, because in order to do this, we need to build development for residential, commercial, mixed-use facilities nearby, hotels and things like that. And we need to create a new river walk running along the edge that will allow you to have access back to the river again. So here's an example of something that we might do, or that we're planning currently to do. We found out that all of this stuff that looks like flat ground, which is just a kind of concrete surface, is actually built on piles floating over the natural terrain of the waterfall underneath. So they didn't dynamite the waterfall, they just built sticks and then built a flat thing on top of it. So once we discovered that, we realized all you have to do is pull the concrete back, and you will expose the natural terrain of the original waterfall. And then if we let the dam loose, the water will flow through here during certain times of the year. And some of these buildings, which are empty, will cut slots through the bottom of them and allow the water to run through the building. You can take bridges through the building and watch the waterfall go through the building under your feet, and then stand on the edge and overlook the waterfall in its natural conditions. Nearby, we'll create areas for festivals and activities. We're creating a calendar for events so that people's life and natural flora and fauna lives don't interfere. We're cataloging and registering every piece of flora and fauna across the site to develop it into the new designs. Here's one of those features where we've taken the roof off the top of this storage facility. We'll take a giant saw and cut new ravines in the concrete, which is about 2 feet thick, and plant life up there that doesn't interfere with the tourists that might arrive. We're creating new nests for birds up in the tops of these industrial facilities. So all in all, we hope to bring back the natural character of this place alongside its cultural character. Sometimes when, in this particular case, we'll allow sunlight in, it'll hit the water below your feet and then project back up onto the surfaces. It'll be this very serene and very quiet and still understanding of water and its meaning in this context. Some of the walkways will run along the edge of the river and allow access to the fall in a unique way that hasn't been there for nearly 60 years. So we're working on it right now. It's getting approvals, and we're in sort of the early design stages. So I don't know, maybe I'll see you in 15 years and this thing will be done and we can have nice pictures. Sometimes we have to do some small things so we can see them finished in our lifetime. This was a project that we were asked to make a little bench on the street in San Francisco, and we decided to make a rocking garden or a rocking lawn. So the bench is a rocking chair, and planted on top of it is grass, and you can lay in the grass and rock back and forth on Market Street in San Francisco. To do this, we actually planted the grass in our studio because we didn't have anywhere else to do it in San Francisco. So we made the whole lawn in the studio. We nurtured its growth all the way through. This was very difficult because in San Francisco, one of the employees has an office dog that comes every day, and man, it wanted to pee on that grass. It was like we had to constantly keep the dog away from the grass. But we made it through, and we set it out on the street, and it became a very fun thing to see. Children would play on it, and you could sit on the edges and hold those pieces and rock back and forth. It was quite popular, and so they've asked us to do a couple of more of these. Working with children is always a delight. And we had that experience in this project in particular. The Swarovski Crystal Company asked us to make their corporate headquarters and their corporate facilities for their staff and the people that lived in the community surrounding their industrial facility. Originally, they said to us, Make something for the people that work here, cafes, restaurants, community center, and also maybe there's something for the kids. And so we reversed the order, and we put all the kids in this amazing tower. So this is a 5-story play tower, and we put all the adults in this kind of little thing down here. And so what the kids get is this amazing place where they can play on each level. There are trampolines and climbing facilities all the way up it. And, you can jump up and down and yell through the floors. The kids just love it. And, of course, they're Austrian kids, so they're not afraid of heights. And you can see the mountains in the distance. And it was really an exciting thing to work on, even for the architect doing the punch list. This is the architect doing the final inspection before the children came in. Not too far from Innsbruck. Another little project we made, which was very, very quick, it was a pavilion for a light festival in Singapore. This project was only meant to be up for 2 weeks. We decided, why make a pavilion that gets torn down in 2 weeks and that's the end of it? Instead, it could be disassembled and turned into things that could be used elsewhere after the festival was over. So we made this bamboo dome, and inside each of the little coffers of the bamboo are little solar-powered lights. So during the day, they catch the sun, and at night, they release the light. And the theory was that these beautiful lights not only would be wonderful during the light festival, but after the festival was over, each of the lights could be taken off the pavilion and shipped to a remote agricultural community where they have very little electricity and very little light to access components of their community. So this is a detailed view of each of those solar-powered lights. And we still get pictures occasionally. This is a little well next to a farm, and they have the little solar-powered light there so they can see the well at night. So it's a very helpful kind of a connection to people that we don't even know. So that tells you also a little bit about the life of something. So all of that talks about the habitat of things around us. But what about who we are? A studio is a habitat. So I often say, architects, generally speaking, are kind of left-leaning. They're sort of liberal and progressive, most of them. And you talk to them and they talk about progressive things. You walk into their office and it's so hierarchical, it would make, Putin embarrassed. There's like this fantastic pyramid, and the boss is up there, and there's this army of slaves that have just gotten out of school working for free, doing whatever they can do not to get fired. And it's not right. How can you talk about this and be like that? So we promote diversity, we promote awareness, we promote engagement within the different groups in the studio. We're architects, landscape architects, interior architects, we're branding and graphic designers. We try to hold a rich mix between women and men, about 50-50, which is hard in this profession. We're still very, very shy on minority representation, or let's just say any representation beyond the normal kind of statistics of Caucasian within our field. So we're working harder to look at ethnicity and racial issues within our office. We are proud of the fact that we have 14% left-handed holders that's more than most offices have, so that's a good thing. When you walk into our office, there's no receptionist, so nobody's there to greet you or tell you what to do or tell you you can't go here or you can't go there. You just walk straight in, and you walk into the kitchen, actually, and so there's this kind of nice feeling when you see a kitchen. We like our kitchen, and originally, when we built it, we made this beer tap back here. It was really exciting, but we were a little embarrassed by that, so we put a fruit bowl in front so we would look a little bit healthier. And we do actually eat the fruit from time to time. Next to that is an area where we get physical. We're always making things and changing things. We build models together. In this particular picture, you have the youngest person in the studio and some of the older, more experienced people working together to make a single model, which is hard to cultivate that kind of atmosphere. We're transdisciplinary in the fact that we work across boundaries. A lot of people like to use the word collaborate. Well, what does collaborate really mean? It's kind of an overused term. Basically what it means is you get a bunch of people from different backgrounds and different disciplines. They all sit around the table and they represent their knowledge base to the rest of the table. Well, that's useful and it's not a bad thing. But what if, for a moment, you could say, well, maybe me as an architect could talk about landscape architecture, and let's allow the landscape architect to talk about architecture, and let's allow the interior designer to create graphic design, or at least talk about it or discuss it around the table. So we wear each other's shoes, and that creates for open atmosphere. We don't have any enclosed meeting rooms, so we all meet generally in this big room. You can have 4 or 5 meetings going on at once because of the acoustics in the space. This is a little view of one of our previous office before we moved into the one you just saw. You can see we sit there, we work there, different meetings going on. We also eat there, so there are times of the day when people will, especially around lunchtime, they'll start to bring out their food, and there's a kind of the end of the day sort of spirit that happens. So I'm going to go into a couple more projects in more detail, but I want to sign off this so-called introduction by saying that when we talk about architecture, when we learn about architecture, we are generally thinking about it in a formalistic way. Isn't that look good? Isn't this look amazing? Isn't that a beautiful thing? Oh, I want to go over and see that thing. And we're talking about its formalistic terms. But the reality is that what we do is as much about people as it is about the forms we try to represent. No matter what kind of formal theory you may have, underneath it all, people have to deal with what you make. They have to react to what you make. And so, in a sense, what we need to talk about is the value of each other as much as the value of the formal objects we make. And if we can do that enough, the formal objects will become a natural sort of progression of these issues that we see within one another.